15 miles behind the front, a German staff captain unrolled his map in a stone farmhouse and told his runner they were finally safe. The glass blew inward before he finished. A 100-pound American, 155mm shell came through the roof, turned oak beams to matchsticks, and made the floor jump like a drum. Men clawed at dust, ears ringing, trying to understand how an enemy they could not see had just reached them. The truth was simple and terrible. The Americans had guns that broke distance. That weapon was the 155mm gun M1, the Long Tom. It threw heavy, high-explosive out to roughly 15 miles, farther with perfect weather and charge. The projectile rode a clean arc through the grey Normandy sky and fell with a moan that ended in a white flash. Farmers miles away felt the strike in their chests. Clerks at that map table felt their courage thin. Range changed everything. A commander who thought he had an hour to plan now had seconds. What shocked the enemy most was not only metal, it was the speed and certainty with which American crews turned numbers into hits. In a canvas fire direction tent, a sergeant with a pencil took an observer's grid, added wind, powder temperature, and drift, and called a firing solution in plain English. He did it again 30 seconds later, then again, each time faster. The crew worked like a factory line in a muddy field. Ram, seat, close, fire. The gun recoiled and came back on aim as if it wanted the next round. Every man had a simple job. Every job fit the next. The first salvo shattered more than a roof. It shattered a way of thinking. German officers had trained to fight forward and to mass near the front. Now they learned what it meant to be hunted from deep. Headquarters dispersed into barns. Radios whispered. Motor pools moved at night. Each change bled time and fuel. When the Long Toms reached out, they forced the enemy to live small. America chose the opposite. Live big, move big, hit big, then do it again, tomorrow. A corporal on the gun line watched smoke drift and grinned because he knew what came next. Time on target. It was the American magic that looked like thunder. The Fire Direction Center synchronized watches across batteries miles apart, computed different flight times, and told each gun when to fire, so every shell arrived together. To a man in the target zone, it sounded like one impossible explosion. There was no warning. There was no time to run. The first 10 seconds did the work of 10 minutes. Now picture the road outside that farmhouse. Wagons jackknifed. A motorcycle lay on its side with its wheel still spinning. A typewriter sat in the ditch with a key bent like a tooth. A staff map flapped on a hedge with a fresh hole punched through the Ardennes. The runner who had fetched coffee stared at the sky for the gun he could not see and whispered that the Americans had learned to bend distance. He was right. In American hands, math bent distance and made it obey. The men on the guns were citizens first. A machinist from Ohio read the bubble level with the care he gave crankshafts. A math teacher from Iowa worked the slide rule and called corrections in a steady voice that calmed nerves. A farmer from Kansas stacked powder canisters like hay bales, fast and neat. They did not look like wizards, yet they performed a magic that came from school desks, shop floors, and union halls. The United States had not only built a gun, it had built a system that turned everyday skills into battlefield science. On another field, a little liaison plane, the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, drifted in a slow circle. The pilot saw a convoy nose into a lane, called a grid, and watched the first ranging round bloom a hedgerow short. Left 200, add 100, he said, and the second round fell in the road. Fire for effect, and the sky answered. German drivers braked by reflex. Horses reared in harness. Everything stopped because one American with a radio and 2 batteries on call made it stop. The canvas-winged dragonfly had teeth. On the receiving end, men reached for meaning. A young German artillery officer later wrote that heavy shells exploded all around, that the ground trembled, that debris rose high and fell back like black hail. He said men kept fighting on determination, desperation, and raw courage when the big guns tore streets apart. American fire did not mock that courage. It overmatched it with reach, timing, and endurance. That is what a free people can do when they bring education and industry to a field. The shell that broke the farmhouse began far away in a country that could afford to build by the million and ship by the ocean. A truck brought it forward on a road kept open by engineers who could bridge a river overnight. A depot clerk checked it against a card file that ran like a heartbeat. A cook poured coffee for the crew and made sure they had hot food at midnight. This is the part the enemy never saw until it was too late. The American habit of making big systems feel small and dependable. The Long Tom spoke because the nation spoke through it. By dusk, the crews swabbed barrels, logged missions, and tied down prime movers. The sergeant wrote a letter home on the hood of a truck and told his wife the sky had been loud, but he was fine. In the ruined farmhouse, the staff captain found his map in the dirt and pressed it flat with shaking hands. He did not know it yet. But tomorrow the guns would reach just as far, and they would arrive together, and they would do it again the day after that. The distance between a safe rear and a target had vanished, and it was not coming back. The loader shoved the projectile home, the breech slammed shut, and the chief of section checked his watch. There was no drumbeat. There was one breath and the lanyard snapped. A dozen shells were already in the air, a dozen more just leaving, each one climbing at a different second so they would all fall together. Downrange, men did not hear a warning shot. They were simply inside the blast. Time on target felt like a trick, but it was a discipline. The Fire Direction Center knew a shell from a far battery would fly longer than a shell from a near one. So the far battery fired first, the near battery fired later, and the guns in between filled the schedule like notes on a staff. When the clock struck, the target sat inside a sphere of metal. A rifleman said it felt like the sky dropped at once. A private on one Long Tom loved this moment. He had worked on railroad brakes in Pennsylvania and admired things that worked together. He kept his tools oiled and his bearings smooth and took pride in how quickly his crew recovered from recoil. The speed mattered. When a battery got back on the sights and delivered a second wave before anyone could stand, survival dropped like a switch. He simply made sure the next round was ready before the gun settled. The enemy learned the lesson the hard way. A German company moving through an orchard hit the first shock and dropped. In that 2-heartbeat gap, when every man looked for a shell he could not see, the second wave arrived. Branches turned to darts, soil blew sideways. Officers could not rise to shout. Radios lay in puddles with cords cut by fragments. Even veterans who had crossed half of Europe were stunned. The timing felt unfair, like some law of nature had been rewritten by the other side. There was a small wonder behind the big shock. Meteor teams sent wind and temperature so the clock would keep truth. Survey lines stitched fields into a clean grid, so a number from a plain or a hill made sense on every map in every tent. Wire crews laid phone lines, and when shellfire cut them, spliced them back together under that same shellfire. This was not an accident. It was a culture. Americans trained hard and shared procedures so strangers could work as one. A young forward observer on a hedgerow called his correction in a voice that barely shook. He wore a radio like a backpack and carried a notebook dark with smudged grids. He watched a convoy nose into a village street and took a breath. Right. 100. Drop 50. Fire for effect. He knew the clock. He knew that when the first wave fell, the second would be seconds behind, and the third would walk the road like a broom. He did not see the guns. He did not need to. The guns were America arriving on time. Sometimes the men who understood it best were the ones who suffered it. A German paratrooper said later that a time-on-target strike felt like one explosion, not many. Another veteran remembered that when the first shells hit, he looked up by reflex and cursed himself because the reflex ate the only seconds left. They were trained. None of that could outrun a schedule written in math and backed by factories. The human cost of making lightning is measured in sweat as much as blood. Trucks brought powder and shells. Men built pyramids of wood and steel by hand and kept building when their hands blistered. Chiefs of section kept their temper short and their safety long. Cooks sent hot coffee down the line at midnight. Medics taped a sprained wrist so the loader could keep loading. It was a small town in boots, doing what small towns do in a storm, showing up until the storm passed. What made the enemy feel helpless was that the storm did not pass when expected. A commander who thought he could ride out a barrage found the second wave came too soon, and the third walked the ground he had just crawled to. Columns stopped bunching because bunched men died under a clock. Headquarters broke into pieces because a headquarters the size of a barn was a target that could die in one blow. American timing changed German behavior. At dusk, the gun pits looked like burned-in photographs. Brass stood in rows. Powder bags lay in tubs like pale fish. Long toms rested with breeches open to the night air. Crews ate, cleaned, checked, and set their watches by signal corps time. The chief told a story about a factory back home that made a bomber every hour and said the battery was that factory now, out in the open, making minutes that broke the enemy's day. The men laughed because it felt true. They had seen the faces of men who met the clock. On the other side of the line, a German captain wrote, "There was no answer to thunder that arrived all at once. You could dig deep. You could pray. You could leave your post and risk a court-martial. But you could not run faster than a schedule set by strangers who had decided your chosen second would be your last quiet one." He ordered his men to spread out, to move by twos, to keep 5 trees between friends. It helped a little. It did not change the sky's will. The private on the long tom wiped the breech face with a rag. He heard crickets past engine noise. He reset his watch and thought about the note he would write to his mother. He would not tell her about the sound men made when the third wave hit. He would tell her about the pie the cook scrounged and the way the little plane tipped its wings like a salute. Tomorrow he would do it again. Downrange, a man would feel the first shock and look up, and in that small act he would lose the last seconds he had. Rain hammered the canvas and the lamp swung on its wire while the sergeant did math with a pencil. The observer's voice came through the handset in clipped phrases. He gave a grid, a target description, and a tight correction. The sergeant ran the numbers, called deflection and quadrant, and said, "1 round, adjust." The shot went. The burst showed. The second correction walked the round into a stone barn where trucks hid. "Fire for effect," he said, and the battery obeyed. In a minute the barn was a hole. In 5 minutes the road was empty. Most soldiers never saw the tent. They saw only the effect, the way American guns found a place they could not see and made it a crater. Inside, the method was simple, exact, and repeatable. Survey teams had already tied every field to a grid with stakes and tape, and a patience that did not quit for weather or shelling. Meteor teams had sent wind, air temperature, and powder temperature, so the math matched the sky. The FDC had maps on plywood, a line to every gun, and a clock that set the pace for the day. A young corporal on data duty once taught algebra in Iowa. He had a calm voice and a way of saying numbers that slowed other men's breathing. He wrote with a pencil stub until his fingers went black. When a correction came, he found the new deflection with the ease of a man flipping a light switch. He was not a hero in the movie sense. He was something rarer, a citizen who brought the exact skill his country needed at the minute it mattered. When the army asked for strength, the nation sent competence. The farmer from Kansas on the battery line treated powder bags the way he treated seed. Careful hands, steady pace, no waste. He stacked, counted, covered, and kept the line ready so the gun never waited. The machinist from Ohio listened to the recoil system like a doctor with a stethoscope and knew when a seal was going bad, 2 shots before failure. The radio man from Brooklyn spoke in short sentences that cut through static like a knife. They were not special in their towns. Together they were the special thing America makes when it asks different people to pull the same rope. Downrange, a German lieutenant crouched in a doorway and later admitted he felt small under American fire. He wrote that the earth trembled and that debris rose high and fell back to injure men below. He said soldiers fought on determination, desperation, and raw courage when the big shells walked the street. He was not a coward. He was honest. What he saw was the effect of a system that joined people who had never met into one act. The long barrel that gave range. The tent that gave numbers. the plane that gave eyes. The question the enemy kept asking was simple. How can they do this so fast and so far so often? The answer was that America made a habit of standardizing and sharing. Radios that worked with other radios. Maps that matched other maps. Parts that fit other guns. A sergeant could borrow a coil from another battery. A chief could trade crews for an hour and not lose the beat. When a wire line got cut, a lineman trotted up with a reel on his back, took 2 sparks in the rain, and had the net alive again in minutes. Reliability turned into a weapon, and that weapon never left the rack. There was also mercy in the American system, and mercy has a power of its own. When German soldiers became prisoners, many crossed the Atlantic to camps that were orderly and fed by the same supply machine that fed the gun crews. Some camps covered hundreds of acres and held thousands of men. Kitchens baked bread, and sometimes scooped ice cream into paper cups for men who had never tasted it. A few prisoners gained weight, wrote home about clean bunks, and told their mothers they were being treated like human beings. The message was not shouted. It was lived. A strong country can be generous and still be strong. Back under the canvas, the sergeant felt the storm ease and heard the grasshopper's engine somewhere beyond cloud. He checked his figures, sipped cold coffee, and thought about men far away who trusted numbers they could not see. He knew the FDC had one duty: never waste a round, never waste a second. He knew the gun line had one duty: be ready when the word came. He knew the little plane had one duty: see what others could not. When all three kept faith, the enemy felt alone in a very crowded place. What the enemy called sorcery was only the American habit of teaching and practice. A high school in Des Moines taught the corporal to love clean answers. A factory in Cleveland taught the machinist to love machines that stay fixed. A farm in Kansas taught the loader to love steady hands. An immigrant shop in Brooklyn taught the radio man to love clear speech. Those loves met under a storm and became a map that led shells to barns and bridges and road junctions. The lieutenant who survived the barrage would write that the first thing he remembered was the timing. By midnight, the tent light burned low. The sergeant rolled his shoulders and rubbed pencil marks from his fingers. He looked at the wall and saw the grid like a city of streets. Each square was a place where a boy would live or die tomorrow. He closed his eyes and said a quiet prayer for the men who would walk those squares, and for the men whose job was to make their walk possible. He did not pray for easy work. He prayed to be exact. When the handset rattled again, he was ready. He wrote the grid, ran the numbers, and sent the next round on the long shore road that America had built to the target. The fog on Hill 314 burned away, just as the radio crackled and the first German tanks nosed into Mortain. A young American forward observer lay in the grass with his handset pressed to his ear and his map torn at the folds. He looked down the slope and saw half-tracks stacking up on a narrow street, saw a church spire pointing at a sky that felt too quiet, and said, calm as a teacher at a board, "Right, 200, drop 100, 1 round, adjust." The ranging shot burst white against a hedgerow. A door fell flat. A horse reared. A gunner leaned out of a hatch and vanished in dust. Left 100. Fire for effect. The hill answered with a deep breath that rose from fields far behind him. Operation Lüttich began at dawn on 7 August 1944. A desperate German counterstroke toward Avranches meant to split the Americans and throw them back into the sea. The men on Hill 314 belonged to the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, who had fought through hedges and now found themselves alone on a high knob in the center of a storm. Below them, armored regiments pushed with names that had frightened Europe for years. The hill had no magic walls. It had a radio net, trained observers, and American artillery that could reach across miles and arrive on time. The forward observer adjusted again and felt the phenomenon veterans never forgot. Time on target. He could not see the far batteries, but he knew the clock they all obeyed. A shell from a distant gun flew longer than one from a near gun, so the far battery fired first, the near one later, and when the second hand hit the mark, the street below became a moving cloud. Drivers ducked by reflex. That reflex ate the only seconds they had. The second wave landed. The invisible hammer did its hard work before anyone could stand. A German officer later wrote that heavy shells exploded all around, that the ground trembled, that debris rose high and fell back to injure men below. On Hill 314, those words were not literature. They were the air the defenders breathed. A rifleman counted to 5 between waves and learned there was no safety in 5. Machine gunners looked for muzzle flashes and found only smoke and falling slate. A runner dashed for water and came back with a shell splinter in his canteen. The observer kept his voice even because even voices kept men alive. Left 100. Add 50. Repeat. He did not shout when a turret slewed toward the hill and green tracers stitched past his rock. He did not flinch when a mortar round cracked behind him and stung his neck with stone. He measured, corrected, and summoned the weight of a continent. The gun crews miles away never saw his face. They did not need to. They worked a rhythm that citizens bring from ordinary life. Measure twice, act once, repeat without panic. The attack stalled, then tried a new street, then tried a new hour. Each time the radio net turned and poured steel. The little liaison plane, a Piper L-4 Grasshopper with a 65 horsepower engine and fabric wings you could patch with doped cloth, slid along the clouds and called out a motor column here and a staging area there. Right 200. Fire for effect. Barns disappeared. Bridges winked out. Reserve troops huddled in orchards and watched branches shred into needles. There was a moral force in that steel. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. A free nation had sent boys to a hill with the promise it would not leave them blind. It sent radios, survey crews, sound-ranging teams, spare coils, spark plugs, wire by the mile, powder by the ton, and cooks who packed hot coffee into urns riding on jeeps. It sent discipline taught at Fort Sill and a habit of standardizing parts so a broken truck did not end a day. It sent a clock that everyone could see and obey. That is what scared the enemy most. Not only power, but order. Down in Mortain, a German sergeant tried to wave his men forward after the first shock. He raised his arm and half of it vanished in a white blink. He did not scream until after the second wave. A medic crawled with a tin box and reached 3 men. The 4th was gone. The company commander spat plaster from his teeth and told himself the American guns would have to slow. They did not slow. The clock was the clock. The forward observer finally changed position, crawling with the handset clamped to his chest, counting seconds out of habit because seconds were how you lived. He settled behind a broken wall and marked the slope with quick, neat pencil lines. He spoke again. Far away, a chief of section checked deflection, quadrant, powder temperature and safety and gave a steady order. The long tom recoiled, its trail biting wet soil. The loader's hands were raw under grime. The prime mover idled like a patient animal between pulls. As hours passed, the hill tasted dust and cordite and fear, and something else men only name later. Pride. The infantry who held the rocks, and the observers who called the steel, did something that sounds like boasting until you look down that ruined road. They stopped a counter-offensive, with a map, a radio, and an artillery arm that could reach across miles and obey a whisper. The price was blood. The result was daylight that belonged to them. When the push finally ebbed, the observers wrote short lines in notebooks that smelled of damp and graphite. Mortain. Multiple tots. Effects. Heavy. Armor movement broken. They did not write the invisible line under those words, the one tying a boy on a hill to a factory in Detroit, a survey class at Fort Sill, a signal school in New Jersey, a powder plant in Pennsylvania, a truck driver on the Red Ball, a cook with a ladle, and a mechanic with a socket wrench. The enemy felt that line even if he never saw it. By evening, clouds glowed red over the valley, and the church spire stood jagged. The observer finally noticed his hands. They shook a little. He smiled anyway. He had seen what the enemy only guessed, that America could turn many far things into one near thing at the exact second it mattered. He folded his map, closed his eyes, and let the clock in his head tick toward dawn. The little plane skimmed the hedges like a dragonfly, its engine a steady hum that sounded harmless until the ground below began to vanish. It was a Piper L4 Grasshopper, a liaison aircraft with fabric skin, a 65-horsepower engine, and a stall speed so low it could float like a kite over orchards. The pilot wore a baseball cap under his headset. The observer, knees braced to the plexiglass, held a map, a grease pencil, and a throat microphone. He marked a convoy nosing into a village, read a church spire and a bend of road for a fix, and said a few quiet words into the net. On the horizon, gun pits flashed, and seconds later the village buckled like a rug snapped by giant hands. Down below, men learned that a tiny airplane could summon a weight of iron no fortress could ignore. The Grasshopper did not carry bombs. It carried vision. It could lift off from pastures, land on farm tracks, and orbit so slow the pilot could count haystacks. At 500 feet he could see camo nets sag, trucks turn, and men point. He could smell manure and wood smoke and cordite, the human signs that a map square was alive. His observer spoke the language the ground understood. Grid, shift, add, fire. The effect looked like a magic trick. It was the practice of free people who taught each trade well and tied them all together. In hedgerow country, the L4 and its cousin the Stinson L5 Sentinel became the eyes of American artillery. They found gun flashes for counter-battery fire. They saw columns snake out from wood lines. They watched crossroads that mattered and wrote down what time trucks chose to risk them. They were slow and unarmed and very hard to kill because they flew low and quiet and used the land like a friend. A German machine gun spitting into the sky might chase one off a minute or two. It could not chase off the system that stood behind every whispered correction. Picture a morning after rain. A pilot bounces into the sky off two cowpaths crossed like an X. He climbs over a hedgerow and tips a wing to a barn roof where a signal panel says hello in fluorescent cloth. He slides his seat back a notch and sets the airplane into a patient circle. The observer puts binoculars to his face and becomes a hawk that can talk to thunder. Right, 200, drop 100. A shell snaps the ground. Fire for effect. Then the village's far wall becomes smoke, and the near wall falls into the street, and everything with wheels stops moving. The pilot looks away only to check a second orbit. He knows what happens to crews who stare at their own work too long. On the ground, an American rifle platoon hears the soft engine note and relaxes its shoulders because it means the big guns are watching with friendly eyes. A German sergeant hears the same note and spits a curse because his people are about to be measured and found. The power of the Grasshopper was humble. It did not shout. It noticed. It added the kind of details only a human can add. There is a wagon by the fourth poplar. There is dust on a lane that was clean 10 minutes ago. There are figures in the orchard picking through packs. Those small truths turned into firing data that a corporal with a pencil made exact. A battery chief took the numbers and made them safe and lethal. A loader turned them into muscle and smoke. A liaison team at a crossroads rolled wire off a drum so a colonel could speak to 3 groups in one breath. The country that could give a boy a cheap airplane and a clear task also gave him a road for fuel, a crate of spark plugs, and a way to call 3 kinds of help at once. Sometimes the help was counter-battery. The pilot would see a flash in a hedgerow and trace the angle with his thumb on the window frame. He would mark the point on a map and read it, and a minute later shells would walk the source backward until it quit. Sometimes the help was interdiction. Trucks moved at night to dodge fighter bombers, so the L4 counted tire tracks at dawn and circled the gaps. A round on a culvert could stop a day's movement cold. Sometimes the help was simply mercy. The pilot saw a white cloth in a door and called the symbol to the ground, so the battery shifted 50 meters left. The observer understood that power and kindness can live in the same voice. A captured German later said that when he heard the little airplane he felt a weight in his stomach because the Americans would now see like a god. He was not saying the pilot was better than him. He was saying the system behind that pilot was bigger than any he had faced. It sent radios that worked after rain. It sent maps that matched across units. It sent spare parts to a field in 2 hours, because a depot clerk and a truck driver lived by a schedule. It sent gasoline across France on the Red Ball Express, so the L4 could fly dawn to dusk. At the peak, the Red Ball moved thousands of tons a day, not to make a number on a ledger, but to make an orbit like this happen on time. The enemy could see the effect even if he could not see the cause. In the open, the grasshopper felt like a toy, but every toy needs a hand. The American hand was a nation's habit of solving problems in plain sight. When the pilot landed in a pasture to refuel, a farmer's boy waved, and the crew waved back and swapped a candy bar for directions to a field hard enough to use if the wind shifted. War bent the world, but some rules held. Courtesy makes work go faster. By dawn, the plane would rise again, and another secret would vanish under American eyes. The corporal stood on a crate and looked over a plain of wood and steel that went to the hedges. Crates of 155mm shells stacked higher than a barn roof. Powder cans in neat rows. Fuses in tins. Trucks weighted with engines popping, canvas tops tight, and chalk marks on their bumpers that read like a map of victory. He grinned and said a line that would travel the battalion. We could pave a road to Berlin with this. It was not a boast, it was inventory. America had brought mountains to France and taught them how to move. The depot sat on dry ground, laid out like a grid. Signs hung from posts so a driver could find anything at a jog. A clerk with a clipboard checked lot numbers, made sure powder matched projectile, and pushed a wooden token across a board when a truck rolled out. Another clerk pulled a card from a file and stamped the hour. A cook ladled coffee and balanced a tray on the tailgate, while a mechanic listened to a misfiring engine and swapped a plug in 2 minutes flat. The trucks were GMC CCKW 2.5-tonners, the deuce and a half that became an American signature. They lined up, swallowed loads, and left in convoys that did not sleep. On the roads ahead, the Red Ball Express drew a bold line east and never let it cool. It moved thousands of tons a day at its peak, gasoline, bread, boots, and shells, every mile guarded by MPs and signs that said keep moving or get off. The rule was simple. The front eats first. The corporal hopped down and helped roll a shell into a cradle. He felt the weight in his hands and the idea behind it in his chest. A country far away had poured ore into heat, turned heat into steel, turned steel into a shape, and sent that shape across an ocean so a loader could turn it into survival for a friend. The numbers were large enough to look like fiction, so the men turned them into acts. Lift, seat, lash, go. When a battery fired hard for an hour, a truck column flexed like muscle and refilled it before the barrel cooled. That was the miracle. Not a single burst, but the certainty of the next burst and the next after that. A German gun crew could guess when it was safe to lift their heads. An American gun crew learned that the only limit was discipline and daylight. Behind that belief stood factories that did not close, railheads that worked by lantern, and ships that crossed cold water in columns so long you could not see the ends. Standardization was the quiet king. Powder charges came in bags that fit. Fuses screwed into threads that matched. A spare recoil seal sat in the right bin 5 minutes from the road, because a depot sergeant believed in labels. If a prime mover lost an axle, a parts crate that fit any truck in the fleet appeared by afternoon. Nobody debated whether a left-handed bolt from Street Lewis would marry a right-handed bracket from Buffalo. It did, and the gun went back into the fight. That was the American habit. Make many things the same so that many strangers can fix each other in the dark. The enemy saw the habit through a keyhole. He saw barrages that did not thin out. He saw convoys arrive after rain turned roads to grease. He saw broken bridges replaced by Bailey spans that rose like erector sets by lantern light. He guessed at the size of the hand that held him down, and guessed too small. At one depot day, the sky went low and mean, and mud got into everything men touched. Tarps sagged. Pallets sank by inches. A truck bogged to its hubs and groaned. The corporal whistled, waved an engineer crew, and watched them lay pierced steel planking down a lane in the mud. Tractors nudged the truck free, By noon, the lane was a silver ribbon. By evening, 5 more ribbons crossed the yard. The mountain moved again because Americans hate stuck. A German POW working fatigue watched all this with careful eyes. He had been a mechanic before the war. In the cage, he kept his head down, then finally told a guard, "Your parts fit in every truck. Ours did not." He did not say it to flatter. He said it because he understood what he was seeing. Strength is not only a number, it is the choice to make tomorrow's problems small by making today's tools simple. Another day, the convoy took fire on a road flanked by hedges. Rifle shots cracked. A driver cut left. The second driver braked too hard and slewed across the ditch. The column halted 3 seconds, and then a sergeant's voice cut the air like a whistle. "Push that truck off. Keep moving. Go, go." Chains came off hooks, tires bit, engines roared. The stuck truck slid to the side, cargo intact, and the line rolled. Payday was not the ledger. Payday was the shell that reached a hilltop at sunset because someone back here refused to let a road become an excuse. At dusk, the depot quieted to a murmur. The corporal walked the lanes and ran his palm along stenciled letters, he M107 M1, and numbers that meant something to men who lived by numbers. He checked the powder shack thermometer and wrote the reading in a neat hand because powder that runs hot or cold fools math, and math must not be fooled. He nodded to the guard at the gate and to the cook who had scrounged apples for a pie to go with beans. He tied one last tarp and looked out across a field that still looked like a mountain. It no longer felt heavy to him. It felt like promise. Across the line, that promise took the shape of a long tom speaking at range, an infantryman standing up when the barrage lifted, a medic walking upright because the shells had kept machine guns quiet long enough to let him cross open ground. The mountain became safety and speed and pressure that bent an enemy plan out of shape before the second hand could finish a lap. Men remember loud moments. They should also remember this quiet one. Labels, crates, ladders, parts, hands, and rules that put the right thing in the right place at the right time. That is how the impossible becomes routine. When the corporal finally lay down on a canvas cot, he could still hear trucks coming and going beyond sleep. He smiled because he knew those sounds meant the gun line would not go hungry tomorrow. They also meant something grander. They meant a free people had found a way to turn distance into a tool and chaos into a schedule. They meant the next time a boy on a hill whispered a grid into a handset, the answer would come on time and keep coming until danger broke. And they meant that when the war ended and the prisoners came home, some of those men would remember the pie, the hot coffee, and the quiet way an enemy made sure even his captives ate. A nation strong enough to lift mountains proved strong enough to be decent while it did. That is a kind of armor, too, and it shines even in the dark. The prime mover snapped a half shaft at noon, and the crew didn't curse. A mechanic slid under the chassis, held a new part in his teeth, and bolted it home while the chief of section checked his watch. The truck rose with a groan and backed to the lunette as if nothing had happened. That rhythm break, replace, resume, was no accident. It was a national decision made in machine shops and schoolrooms long before Normandy. Parts would fit, threads would match, manuals would read the same in any unit, and a kid with a socket wrench could put a war back on schedule. Standardization began with labels and ended with lives. Powder charges came in bags sewn to a spec, fuses screwed into noses cut to a gauge, recoil seals sat in crates stenciled so big a tired corporal could read them in rain. Prime movers, the M4 and M5 high-speed tractors, and the faithful GMC CCKW deuce and a half shared habits and spares, so a stranded gun was scarcely stranded at all. A battery could borrow a coil or a wheel from a neighbor because the neighbor used the same coil and the same wheel. That sameness turned darkness, mud, and fear into problems small enough for human hands. A Czech mechanic, captured in Brittany, watched a depot crew swap an axle on a deuce and a half and shook his head. In 1 hour, 3 Americans fixed what our shop would schedule next week, he said later in the POW cage. He wasn't flattering enemies. He was weighing systems. He had served under a war machine that loved rare parts and exceptional solutions. It bled time it couldn't afford. Now he watched a free nation love ordinary things made in extraordinary numbers, bolts, plugs, gaskets, and turn them into speed. The fire direction tent lived by the same creed. Plotting boards mounted the same way across the army. Grids matched across divisions. A corporal could walk into a strange FDC, hang his jacket on a nail, and start calling deflection in 10 minutes because the math, slang, and safety rules travelled like a friendly dialect. When an observer said, "Drop 100," there was no local translation, only action. You could move a battalion at dawn and mass it with strangers by noon. You could trade a broken radio for a working one without a prayer and a file. It simply snapped into place. Factories wrote the language that the field spoke. Plants in Detroit and Buffalo proved what an assembly line can do when it refuses to quit, turning out trucks, engines, and radios in numbers that still look like misprints. Powder plants in Pennsylvania packed charges by the trainload and stamped every lot with a number a sergeant could trust. A clerk with a pencil made the giant thing small. His card file meant a prime mover in a muddy orchard, got the right seal by afternoon, not next week. A schedule at the railhead meant tomorrow was a promise, not a wish. But the human piece mattered most. The FDC sergeant had taught algebra last year and loved clean answers. The recoil man had tuned crankshafts in Ohio and loved machines that stayed fixed. The farm kid on powder detail loved stacks straight as fence lines and canvas tied tight against weather. Different accents, same pride. Not perfect, just prepared. If the order came to march at 0300, they rolled wire, lashed crates, hitched guns, and went. By 0600, the same tent stood on new ground, map on plywood, clock synchronized, radio alive. A German officer tried to explain the American edge to his colonel after a bad day. Their guns broke and stayed broken. Ours broke and came right back. Their wires went dead and stayed dead. Ours glittered with splices that somehow survived more shelling. He admitted that when a US battery vanished at midnight and turned up 5 miles away before lunch, he felt hunted by a machine that slept in shifts and woke hungry. He wasn't wrong. Standardization made movement a habit, not a gamble. Karl, a former German motor sergeant peeling potatoes in Texas, offered a verdict while spinning a nut with a box wrench. "Your parts fit in every truck. Ours did not," he told the American sergeant. The sergeant slid him an apple and answered, "Ordinary is our secret." They both smiled. Ordinary, repeated with care, becomes a miracle that looks like routine. The miracle at the gun line wasn't a single perfect salvo, it was that the next salvo came on time, and the next after that. Standardization also guarded seconds, the currency of time on target. A dead handset meant a simple swap, not a scavenger hunt. A flooded carburetor meant the same drill in every motor pool. A misfire meant the same safety call, no matter who stood at the breach. When far guns and near guns must obey a single second hand, needless differences are thieves. America fired the thieves and kept the clock. One wet evening, the system met its favorite enemy, mud. Tarps sagged. Pallets sank by inches. A truck bogged to its hubs and groaned. The section leader whistled in an engineer crew. They laid pierced, steel planking, a glittering path where boots had vanished. A tractor nudged the truck free. In an hour, the lane shone like a ribbon. The mountain of crates began to move again. Men remember thunder. They should also remember this. A nation that hates stuck turns holes into roads and roads into results. By dusk, the crew washed grit from their hands at a water can, while the mechanic tightened one last bolt by feel. The prime mover idled, ready to tow. The chief of section set the brakes on the trail and looked downrange as if he could see 15 miles through haze. He didn't need to. He trusted the sameness around him to turn orders into action at any hour. Somewhere, a German staff officer stared at a map and tried to guess where American guns would be by morning. He would guess wrong, because the answer was simple. Anywhere the schedule said, and the schedule always held. When the lamp clicked off, the field stayed orderly in the dark. Crates faced outward. Wire ran straight. A wrench lay exactly where a tired hand would find it by touch. A free people had made chaos obey with labels, threads, and habits that followed the flag. The long tom slept. The system did not. At first, light it would wake, fit the same parts to the same jobs, and make victory sound like routine. Dusk settled like smoke along the tree line when two sharp flashes winked on the horizon. The flash-spotting team marked bearings with practiced hands. The sound, ranging line caught the boom rolling across fields. A lieutenant drew two pencil lines that crossed on a grid square with a hedge and a farmhouse. Counter. Battery, he said into the handset. And men in another field bent to their work. When the first ranging round burst near the hedge, the German flashes paused, then dared a second shot. That was enough. The Americans had their mouth, and they were already reaching into it. Hunting enemy guns is a duel of nerves and method. The Germans were good. They masked with trees, moved by night, fired short missions, and fled. They were not good enough against an army that built artillery intelligence into its bones. The Americans laid flash bases across the front, so many eyes watched the same sky. They ran microphones in shallow pits along sound lines, each one logging the split-second whisper a big gun makes when it speaks. They compared those readings like a band tuning to one note, and that note became a map square that could be punished. An infantryman never saw the graph paper that caught those flashes. He only saw that incoming slowed when counter-battery began to bite. He heard a different cadence. Their shells. Our shells. Then quiet. He learned to love the quiet because silence meant some other man's day had gone worse than his. A barber from Indiana who now ran the plotting board kept his pencil sharp and his temper cool. He liked catching hunters. He liked making the field safe for boys who had to stand up and walk. A Polish conscript forced into a German battery told his American interrogator a plain truth. "Your fire found us before our second salvo," he said, eyes on the floor. He had dragged a gun onto farm tracks by hand, lifted shells until his palms tore, and fired 3 rounds fast so the crew could run. He also knew the sound of a ranging round ripping a hedge too soon. "We learn to shoot and scoot," he said, "but you learn to listen fast." In the camp later he ate well, worked in a motor pool, and admitted to a chaplain that the quiet after American counter-battery felt like mercy. The net reached further than a single duel. Recon pilots came back with photos showing wheel ruts stamped into meadows and fresh cuts in hedges. Grasshopper pilots circled slow, marked flashes with grease pencils on plexiglass, and radioed bearings in voices level as a carpenter's bubble. Sound posts called in timings that felt like music. Station 2, mark. Station 5, mark. The FDC drew a triangle where the lines met and sent a grid to batteries that had never seen the farmhouse in that square. In 5 minutes, a gun pit became a torn field. In 10 minutes, the road that fed it wore craters like stitches. German gunners adjusted, as good soldiers do. They cut missions to fewer rounds. They stacked ammunition in multiple hides. They dug deeper. They rigged dummy guns and lit false fires. Some tricks worked for 2 days. None worked long. The Americans were relentless in a patient way, adding every scrap of information to the same net and letting the pattern expose itself. A habit of sharing made cleverness short-lived. A habit of speed made relocation risky. A habit of mass made even lucky survivors feel hunted. One afternoon, the flash team caught 3 mouths, speaking at once, 3 guns in a little arc like teeth. Soundline numbers bounced in fast, 2.6 seconds, 3.14, from stations strung along a lane where wire ran under hedges. The lieutenant and his sergeant traded a glance they had traded all summer. It said, "We have them." The first American salvos walked the hedgerow like a comb. Branches shaved off. A caisson flipped. A team bolted through a gap and left 2 men pinned beneath a wheel. The flashes quit. The soundposts reported nothing but wind. A German officer wrote later that counter-battery had become unbearable when the Americans massed it. He was not weak. He was trapped inside a new law. The law said guns make light, light makes lines, and lines make targets if someone listens fast enough. The law said if you fire more than once from a hedge, you will not fire a third time from that hedge. He tried to save his crews with speed, cunning, and better holes. The law did not care. The clock did. A U.S. sound-ranging corporal from Ohio kept a little notebook with scribbles that only made sense to him. In its pages you could read a day of battle as a swing of seconds. He would point at a number 2.8 and a square F6 and tell the lieutenant, "Here." He ate cold beans with the same fork he used to tap ash off his cigarette and felt useful in a way that made the mud easier to ignore. His work didn't look heroic. It made heroism survive the hour. Sometimes the duel turned personal. A German battery found our boys on a ridge and hammered them so steadily that helmets rang on skulls and canteens danced. The FDC told the sound line to listen hard. The corporal crouched in his pit and held his breath as if lungs made noise. The pencil lines crossed once, twice, 3 times in the same clump of trees. The lieutenant sent a grid with a tight voice. The first ranging round walked in right. The second found the center. "Fire for effect," he said, and the storm answered. Minutes later, men on the ridge heard only flies. At midnight, the flash base sent its last bearings and shut down the lamp. The sound line coiled wire and wrapped microphones in cloth like babies. The lieutenant folded the map, slid the pencil behind his ear, and listened to the quiet he had helped make. It wasn't perfect quiet. No battlefield is. But it was silence carved by method out of chaos, a gift to men who would stand at dawn and walk. The enemy would fire again. We would listen again. And the same habits watch, share, strike would keep turning hunters into quarry. He stood at the big board with a stopwatch and a calm face while 20 miles of guns held their breath. The Corps artillery commander looked more like a school principal than a warlord, and that made the next 5 minutes feel stranger. He lifted the handset, checked the second hand, and gave the word. Across meadows and lanes, 105 seconds, 155 seconds, and 8-inch heavies fired, according to a schedule that turned distance into choreography. A road junction, 2 bridges, and an assembly area disappeared under timing. A barrage is not a roar. It is a plan spoken in thunder. The schedule said smoke first to blind, then high explosive to break, then a lift to let infantry take the next line without walking into their own storm. The plan marched by the second, H5, H4, H3, H2, H1, H. The first minute blinded everything that could see. The second minute broke everything that could stand. The third minute lifted like a curtain and moved on rails to the next square. A private said it felt like walking behind a moving wall that loved you. The best part was how fast the plan could change without falling apart. A forward observer reported a column detouring onto a farm track. The Fire Direction Center slid 2 battalions onto the new line like a hand on a piano. The rest of the orchestra never missed a note. Radios stitched the air between groups that had never shared coffee. Because everyone spoke the same artillery language, strangers worked like old friends 5 minutes after meeting. That is what a free country sounds like when it agrees on a minute. On the far side of the storm, a German lieutenant tried to keep his men from bunching at a culvert. He knew bunching invited heavy weights. He spread his squads and kept 5 trees between friends. He did everything right, and still watched the second lift arrive where he had hoped for a gap. He tasted smoke and grit, and later admitted the Americans moved a barrage like a good boxer. Moves a jab always where you had just decided to go. There were names for what the map did that morning. Corps mass, group mass, tote, rolling barrage, interdiction fires. Labels mattered to professionals. To riflemen they meant one thing: the earth helps us today. Bridges that should have held for hours held for minutes. Road nets that should have fed the line went empty. Reserves that should have arrived fresh showed up scattered, breathless, and late. The barrage didn't win alone. It made winning look natural. A French resistance guide who had taught music watched the fire map with a captain and grinned. "When you play," he said, "the orchestra obeys." He meant more than guns. He meant trucks that fed guns, engineers throwing Bailey bridges across streams so prime movers could cross, signal crews who ran wire and spliced it faster than shrapnel could cut it, and clerks who kept the right fuses in the right tins at the right crossroads. He meant a nation conducting itself. A US lieutenant loved watches and kept 3 timepieces set to Signal Corps time. He taught his section that a second is not small if you stack enough of them in a plan. He showed new men a schedule and said, "These are seconds that save lives." On the day we crossed a wide river, those seconds made bridges stand. On a day we broke a line that swore it would hold, those seconds made gaps open. Precision looked fussy until it turned into safety by the mile. The enemy did not fold because he was weak. He bent because he was out-timed and outscaled by people who treated punctuality like a weapon. A German captain wrote that American fires appeared as if from a single monstrous battery, then shifted too quickly to counter. He begged for more radios, wire crews, prime movers, and trained survey teams. He got some. He never got enough to match an army that could mass dozens of battalions in minutes and lift them like a curtain call. A private from Kansas who had carried powder bags all summer watched an attack from the lip of a field. The barrage lifted in neat steps, and the men went forward like a tide following the moon. He saw a red flare pop, heard the net crackle, and watched the fire slide right to cover a machine gun nest nobody had marked at dawn. He felt the pride that comes when a giant turns its head because a boy whispers into a handset. He lit a cigarette and tasted dust and thought of the depot that had shipped the powder he'd just hefted. There was mercy in the plan, too. When an aid station raised a panel on a farmhouse roof, the lift carved a clean margin around it, the way a careful carpenter leaves a reveal. The guns were there to break things, but they were also there to spare what didn't need breaking. That discipline came from training that began with math and ended with judgment. Power without care wastes both. A British liaison officer, watching a Corps mission, spoke a sentence that made the Americans grin. "You lot make mass look easy," he said. "It isn't easy. It's the hardest trick a democracy tries, making millions agree on a minute and then act. But when it works, it feels like gravity. It bends the day toward your will. It makes enemies talk about your clocks in the same breath they talk about your courage." Near evening, the Corps commander stood at the board again and let the storm run down. The last smoke rounds puffed on a ridge. The last he walked into a wood line and stopped. Infantry radioed the 3 words every gunner loves to hear on the objective. The commander put the stopwatch in his pocket and finally looked tired. He knew the orchestra would play again in the morning. He also knew today's notes would echo in the enemy's head all night, a loud memory ready to break nerves at dawn. When dark came on, gun lines glowed with cigarette tips and quiet clinks of men checking tools. The plan lay on the board like a dried river. A runner tacked the schedule to a wall because crews like to keep souvenirs of impossible minutes. A boy from Brooklyn traced a finger along the times and whispered, "We did that." He was right. The music of a free people had been loud and exact, and it had turned fear into distance behind a moving wall. Tomorrow the wall would move again, and the men would be exactly on time. A rifleman wrote that when the red-corded artillery opened up, the earth seemed to breathe out and the fear drained from his legs. He had learned what veterans already knew. Timing can be a weapon, and numbers can break nerves. The barrage that morning started with smoke so thick it looked painted on the sky. Then the first wave of high explosive hit like the floor of the world had dropped. In the first 10 seconds, the road dissolved. In the next 10 seconds, the men who had dropped where they stood found there was nowhere safe to crawl. The shock was not only blast, it was the message inside the blast. This will not stop when you think it should. A single 155mm long tom threw a 100-pound shell nearly 15 miles, but a single gun was never the point. The point was how many guns, how fast, and how long. A fire direction center shifted whole battalions by the minute and did it again after a breath. Radios linked strangers who had never shared breakfast into a family that spoke in seconds and grids. When an observer called a new road, 24 tubes turned like a school of fish and were already ranged when the first shell fell. The enemy tried to answer with courage and fresh units and careful dispersion. Courage could not outrun timing. Fresh units bogged in craters. Dispersion only meant each man felt alone when the next wave came. The ferocity on the map rested on a quiet ledger. The Red Ball Express rolled day and night to feed fuel and shells forward, drawing a bright line across France that military police guarded with whistles and iron certainty. A depot clerk made sure powder lots matched gun tables, so math stayed honest. A truck column brought fuses in tins and stacked them where a tired corporal could find the right one by touch. Standardization turned desperation into scheduling. A commander who demanded more fire got it because a factory months ago had refused to accept a thread that did not fit and a shift that did not finish. On the far side of the smoke, a German medic crawled, among stunned men who looked at him with the dazed eyes of people who had tried to think faster than a clock. He packed a dressing with hands that would not quite hold still and waited for the second lift. He later told an interrogator that the Americans made one explosion, not many, and that was exactly how it felt. When the ground shook, it shook everywhere at once. He had trained to endure barrages. He had not trained for the feeling that no decision mattered because the next decision had already been taken out of his hands. The young American observer who called the first mission stayed flat on a hedge bank and spoke in a voice that made other men breathe slower. He did not see the batteries that answered him. He did not need to. He knew they would send exactly what he asked for, and if he was wrong by 50 meters, the second wave would forgive him. That confidence, earned by drills across oceans and months, was itself a weapon. It let him call faster and adjust cleaner. It let him risk a bolder shift because he trusted the net would catch him. The net always did. Later, when someone wrote a report, the page looked dry. Guns fired X missions, expended Y rounds, achieved Z effects on bridges, railheads, staging areas. But the men who were there remembered a different math. They remembered the way a corporal's pencil shaved seconds off a plan and turned those seconds into breathing room for friends. They remembered a truck driver shoving one more load up a ruined lane because a battery chief had promised his boys hot chow only if the ammunition stack reached knee-high again before midnight. They remembered that the barrage did not sag at sunset. It kept its promise. There was a grace in that power too. When an aid station raised a panel, the barrage curved like a hand around the building. When white cloth flickered from a doorway, the observer moved fire by instinct, the way a careful driver steers around a bicyclist. The mission was destruction, but the method was disciplined. American fire did not have to crush everything to win. It only had to crush the right things with absolute certainty, again and again, until the men who faced it began to move slower because they were already beaten in their heads. At dusk, the rifleman who had felt the earth breathe out stood on a berm and watched smoke drift over a shattered road. He realized he had not thought about dying for an hour. He had thought about the next tree line and the way the fire would lift to meet him like a guard dog trained to heal. He took a sip from his canteen, grimaced at the warm metal taste, and smiled anyway. Numbers had become shelter. Timing had become courage. The red chords had become the sound of home moving forward. When the last rounds fell and the last echoes went thin, he shouldered his pack and walked into the quiet that the barrage had purchased 1 second at a time. Dawn showed a low river like a strip of dull tin and a fog line that clung to reeds. Engineers had thrown 2 Bailey bridges in the night rectangles and pins and muscle under lantern light, and now the first tanks idled at the approaches, diesel breath steaming. The artillery plans stacked behind them like a staircase. Smoke would roll, high explosive would batter, the curtain would lift, and infantry would walk as if a giant hand moved with them. The stopwatch in the corps commander's palm ticked toward the second when the world would obey. The opening smoke bloomed white and thick and held like a wall. Then the heavies spoke, the 8-inch guns that few ever saw up close because their job was to break what pride had declared unbreakable. A farmhouse on a bluff lost its corners. The bridge on the enemy's flank buckled into the water. A field gun that had barked past midnight stayed silent now because counter-battery had plucked it out of its hedge at 0300. The plan had run in the dark before it sang in daylight, and that was why the morning felt unfair to the men who tried to stop it. Infantrymen stepped off under the lift with faces grey with sleep and dust. They had learned the cadence. When the wall moved 10 yards, they moved 10 yards. When it paused, they knelt. When a red flare popped from a hedgerow no one had marked at dawn, the fire slid right like a door closing on a draught. A private felt important when a whole brigade's fire changed because of one man's small tube and one clear voice on a radio that had been checked by a corporal who cared about dry wiring. In that moment, America felt not like a map, but like a hand you could put your faith in. On the far bank, a German captain who had promised his colonel to hold, at least until noon, tasted grit and revised his heart. Math. Noon meant nothing now. His machine gun nest took air and splinters instead of targets. His reserve platoon, sent up on the left, found the bridge they needed already broken. He told a runner to fetch the flak half-track for direct fire, but the runner came back with white dust in his eyebrows and a stare that said the road was gone. He was not a coward. He had been timed and overmatched by people who treated punctuality as a weapon. The tanks crossed, pistons thudding. They passed a sign hammered into the planking by an engineer with a tired grin. Weight limit, move like hell. The sign was a joke and a truth. Move like hell because the plan will not wait for you. It will carry the next line whether you ride it or not. The crews waved at the bridge team, a quick salute from men who knew they were being handed something priceless. Seconds. Every arm in the American order of battle respected the king of battle because they all lived on borrowed seconds that the guns paid for. Behind the curtain, the artillerymen kept their own rhythm of work. Swab, ram, close, fire, check bearings, swap powder, listen to the FDC, reset the stopwatch in their heads. They did not see the ripple of men crossing where fear usually lived. They felt it anyway. You can hear it in a net that crackles with short, confident words. You can smell it when a loader stands a little taller between rounds. They knew the lift would end with a deep breath, and then it would start again on a new line they had never seen and would never need to. There was a moment of quiet that felt like a gift. The wall moved forward. The guns paused. A chaplain touched a bridge rail with 2 fingers and muttered thanks. A medic trotted upright across boards that would have been suicide an hour ago and reached a man curled under a culvert with a bloody sleeve. A cook at the far approach popped open a coffee urn like a magician, and a private laughed at the steam as if the trick were for him alone. War is a storm. American artillery can cut a window in the storm and hold it open long enough for better things to pass through. The corps commander lowered his stopwatch and let himself exhale. He was not a man of speeches. He believed in seconds and checklists. He looked at the map, saw the final lift executed on time, and knew the next brigade would meet less steel than they feared. He allowed himself one private thought that men like him sometimes share with each other in mess tents. Without these guns, we would still be on the beach. It wasn't boasting. It was the plain truth of a machine that turns math and fuel and human steadiness into ground gained. On the other side of the ruined bridge, the German captain gathered his men behind a stone wall and counted heads with a finger that would not stop shaking. He told them to dig and to watch the sky, but what he meant was watch the timing. He knew the Americans would lift and land and lift again, and he knew that whatever courage he could scrape out of his ribs would be measured against a clock that did not belong to him. He set his jaw anyway. Good soldiers always do. Then the wall in front of him flickered with dust, and he understood the next minutes belonged to someone else. By noon the smoke had thinned, the crossings held, and the far road carried tracks. The plan had worked because the people inside it had treated the plan like a living thing, fed it, obeyed it, and corrected it without ego when a better path appeared. The men stacked ammo at the approaches so the next lift could be just as heavy as the first. The rifleman who had written about the earth breathing out earlier now watched it breathe forward. He lit a cigarette, coughed, and smiled. The king of battle had crowned the advance again, and what felt impossible at dawn had become ordinary by lunch. In a quiet room after the campaign, a clerk laid out forms, and began to add columns that did not seem real. He wrote the number of missions fired, the tonnage moved by truck and rail, the bridges dropped, the road junctions erased, the batteries silenced by counter-battery, the aid stations spared because the lift curved like a good hand. Each line was dry ink on a dry page. Together they were thunder made visible. Anyone who had stood under that storm would have read the ledger and said, "Yes, that feels right in my bones." The wonder is that the miracle did not feel like a miracle to the people who performed it. An Ohio machinist wiped a recoil cylinder and thought about seals and tolerances. An Iowa math teacher balanced drift and wind on a plotting board and felt the mild joy of a correct answer. A Kansas farmer stacked powder like seed sacks and kept each row tight, because tight rows are how life stays manageable. A Brooklyn radio man checked a handset twice because second chances are rare when seconds are currency. Ordinary care turned into extraordinary effect, day after day, until the extraordinary looked routine. The German officer whose men had tasted time on target wrote that the first seconds were the worst because they knew the second wave would arrive before they could crawl. He said heavy shells exploded all around, that the ground trembled, that debris rose and fell and cut men, already on the ground. He did not write to flatter an enemy. He wrote to say he had met a system that made courage insufficient. Courage mattered, it always does. But courage without fuel and parts and schedules and radios and a nation's habit of solving problems is just a prayer. And prayers do not stop a barrage that arrives together like a door slamming. There were other ledgers that mattered. In camps far from the front, German prisoners ate well, worked at orderly tasks, and sometimes tasted ice cream for the first time. Some gained weight. Some wrote home that they slept under clean blankets and were paid for labor. It was not softness. It was strength, weaponized as decency. A country confident enough to feed its enemies could be trusted by its friends, and trust is a force multiplier no shell can buy. Men who expected cruelty found order. Men who had marched under fear found a place where rules were clear and fair. That difference echoes long after shells stop falling. Back at the batteries, the last missions of a long month stacked on the board like fence rails. The FDC called one more lift to screen a river crossing. The sound-ranging corporal logged his final bearings with a pencil worn to a stump. The mechanic boxed a wrench and patted the fender of a prime mover like a shoulder. The cook poured the last of the coffee and promised pie tomorrow if the supply truck beat the weather. None of them thought they were writing history. They were just refusing to be sloppy on the last inch. The impossible ledger had one more line to add. Time saved. Every minute a barrage stunned, a defender was a minute an American kid didn't spend under open sights. Every bridge that dropped at H10 was a convoy that never formed. Every battery silenced at 0300 was a platoon that crossed at 0315 with shoulders relaxed enough to shoot straight. This is the math of mercy. Precision makes less killing necessary. It seems cold to call it math. It is warmer than it looks, because lives are numbers too, and good numbers stack toward home. Could any other nation have done this at this scale, at this speed, for this long? Others were brave, others were skilled. But only America arrived with the whole kit. The factories that never slept, the standard parts that fit strangers' hands, the radios that carried across rain, the logistics web that fed faraway fields, the schools that had already taught the clerks and mechanics to love exact work, range that turned rear area into target, timing that made many guns feel like one, decency that made captured enemies into witnesses who admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that this thunder was different. The last shell of the day landed on a rail siding where tomorrow's attack would have drawn strength. The smoke lifted and showed nothing fit to move. The observer whispered, "End of mission," and finally let his shoulders sag. In the distance, a small plane banked and wagged its wings, a tired little salute. The guns fell silent and crews began the evening chores that make morning possible. Someone told a joke about going home by Christmas. Someone else said they'd settle for dry socks. Men are always like that when the big work pauses. They think small, and that is how they stay human. In the ledger room, the clerk capped his pen and stared at the totals. He thought of the boys he had seen along roads in the last weeks, mud to their knees, faces grey, eyes determined, and felt something he could not quite name. Pride, yes. Relief, yes. Also a kind of awe that ordinary people could lean their shoulders together and move a mountain one box, one bolt, one shell at a time. He closed the book and laid his palm on the cover, as if to feel the engine cooling under a hood. It had been loud, and it had been exact, and it had been good. The numbers said so. The ground agreed. The future those numbers made would last longer than the thunder that created it,